This is the second of 3 lectures on environmental health and toxicology. In this lecture, we will be learning about the different classes of harmful chemical agents and how they affect us. We will also be learning about how chemicals move in the environment and how they persist and cause damage, even in places far removed from the source of the chemicals. Specifically, at the end of this lecture, you should understand the most common toxic chemicals, explain sick building syndrome, explain the classes of harmful chemical agents, identify how chemicals enter a body and how they interact, explain bioaccumulation and biomagnification, and understand the movement of persistent pollutants in the environment. Toxic means poisonous. Toxicology is the study of the adverse effects of external factors on an organism or a system. This includes environmental chemicals, drugs, and diet, as well as physical factors such as ionizing radiation, ultraviolet light, and electromagnetic forces. In addition to studying agents that cause toxicity, scientists in this field are concerned with movement and fate of poisons in the environment, routes of entry into the body, and effects of exposure to these agents. Toxic substances damage or kill living organisms because they react with cellular components to disrupt metabolic functions. Toxins often are harmful even in extremely dilute concentrations. In some cases, billionths or even trillionths of a gram can cause irreversible damage. Environmental toxicology, or ecotoxicology, specifically deals with the interactions, transformation, fate, and effects of toxic materials in the biosphere, including individual organisms, populations, and whole ecosystems. In aquatic systems, the fate of the pollutants is primarily studied in relation to mechanisms and processes at interfaces of the ecosystem components. Special attention is devoted to the sediment, water, water organism, and water-air interfaces. In terrestrial environments, the emphasis tends to be on effects of metals on soil fauna, community, and population characteristics. This table is a list of the top 20 toxic and hazardous substances considered the highest risk by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, compiled from the 275 substances regulated by the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA. Commonly known as the Superfund Act. These materials are listed in order of assessed importance in terms of human and environmental health. The top 3 hazardous substances are what we call heavy metals and include arsenic, lead, and mercury. Lead and mercury affect the brain. The next 3 substances, vinyl chloride, polychlorinated biphenyls, and benzene, are cancer-causing organic compounds which are common in the environment. Toxic chemicals affect us in a myriad of ways. In this slide, let's learn about some basic definitions. An allergen is any substance that activates your immune system to produce a response. Some allergens act directly as antigens. The antigens are substances such as pollen, bacteria, or certain chemicals that are recognized by white blood cells as foreign bodies and that stimulates the production of antibodies. Antibodies are the proteins that are produced by our body that recognize the antigen and bind to it and remove it from our system. In the photograph, we see a 3-dimensional X-ray crystallographic image of an antibody, that's the green ribbon, in contact with the critical target area, the yellow area, for vaccine developers working on a vaccine for HIV-1, which is the red ribbon. Some people suffer from what is called sick building syndrome. Headaches, allergies, and chronic fatigue caused by poorly vented indoor air contaminated by molds, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, formaldehyde, and other toxic chemicals released by carpets or insulation, plastics, building materials, and other sources. Many buildings that were built during the 1970s lacked windows that could open and/or had poorly designed air handling systems that did not provide sufficient fresh air into the system, leading to a buildup of gases like formaldehyde and mold. Formaldehyde is a good example of a widely used chemical that is a powerful sensitizer of the immune system. It is directly allergenic and can trigger reactions to other substances. Widely used in plastics, wood products, insulation, glue, and fabrics, formaldehyde concentrations in indoor air can be thousands of times higher than in normal outdoor air. The Environmental Protection Agency estimates that poor indoor air quality may cost the nation $60 billion a year in absenteeism and reduced productivity. Sick building syndrome increased significantly after the 1970s as architects and building managers sealed windows to improve energy efficiency but did not compensate with improved circulation or indoor air filtration. Now let's take a look at the 5 classes of harmful chemical agents. These include neurotoxins, which affect the brain tissue, mutagens, that affect genetic materials such as DNA, carcinogens, which are chemicals that cause cancer, teratogens, which are chemicals or biological agents that cause damage to developing embryonic tissue, and endocrine disruptors, which act as hormones. Pictured here is a comparison of the structures of the natural hormone estradiol on the left and one of the non-phenols, right, an endocrine disruptor. Neurotoxins are a special class of metabolic poisons that specifically attack nerve cells or neurons. The nervous system is so important in regulating bodily activities that disruption of its activities is especially fast-acting and devastating. Different types of neurotoxics act in different ways. Heavy metals, such as lead and mercury, kill nerve cells and cause permanent neurological damage. Anesthetics, like ether, chloroform, halothane, etc., and chlorinated hydrocarbons like DDT, dieldrin, and aldrin, disrupt nerve cell membranes necessary for nerve action. Organophosphates like malathion and parathion and carbamates like carbaryl, zenab, and manab inhibit acetylcholinesterase, an enzyme that regulates signal transmission between nerve cells and tissues or organs they innervate, for example, muscle. Most neurotoxins are both acute and extremely toxic. More than 850 compounds are now recognized as neurotoxics. In this photograph, we see the victim of a disease called Minamata disease, which is a case of mercury poisoning in Japan in the late 1950s. When a chemical binds to DNA, the DNA becomes damaged and proper and complete replication cannot occur to make the normal intended cell, enzyme, or protein. This could be the start of a mutation or mutagenesis. Mutagens are agents such as chemicals and radiation that damage or alter genetic material in cells. This can lead to birth defects if the damage occurs during embryonic or fetal growth. Later in life, genetic damage may trigger neoplastic or tumor growth. When damage occurs in reproductive cells, the results can be passed on to future generations. Cells have repair mechanisms to detect and restore damaged genetic material, but some changes may be hidden and the repair process itself can be flawed. It is generally accepted that there is no safe threshold for exposure to mutagens. Any exposure has some possibility of causing damage. In this diagram, we see a DNA adduct, which is a segment of DNA bound to a cancer-causing chemical. Teratogens are chemicals or other factors that specifically cause abnormalities during embryonic growth and development. Some compounds that are not otherwise harmful can cause tragic problems in these sensitive stages of life. Perhaps the most prevalent teratogen in the world is alcohol. Drinking during pregnancy can lead to fetal alcohol syndrome, a cluster of symptoms including craniofacial abnormalities, developmental delays, behavioral problems, and mental defects. Even one alcoholic drink a day during pregnancy has been associated with decreased birth weight. Other well-known teratogens include the rubella virus, that is measles, and also the chemical thalidomide. Carcinogens are substances that cause cancer, invasive, out-of-control cell growth that results in malignant tumors. Cancer rates rose in most industrialized countries during the 20th century, and cancer is now the second leading cause of death in the United States, killing about 500,000 people per year. 16 of the 20 compounds listed by the U.S. EPA as the greatest risks to human health are probable or possible human carcinogens. When a chemical binds to DNA, the DNA becomes damaged and proper and complete replication cannot occur to make the normal intended cell protein. This could be the start of a mutation or mutagenesis, and without effective DNA repair, which happens naturally under normal circumstances, this can lead to carcinogenesis, the beginnings of cancer. One of the most recently recognized environmental health threats are endocrine hormone disruptors, chemicals that interrupt the normal endocrine hormone functions. Hormones are chemicals released into the bloodstream by glands in one part of the body to regulate the development and function of tissues and organs elsewhere in the body. You undoubtedly have heard about sex hormones and their powerful effects on how we look and behave, but these are only one example of the many regulatory hormones that rule our lives. We now know that some of the most insidious effects of persistent chemicals, such as BPA, DDT, and PCBs, are that they interfere with the normal growth, development, and physiology of a variety of animals, including presumably humans, and at very low doses. In some cases, picogram concentrations, that's a trillionth of a gram per liter, may be enough to cause developmental abnormalities in sensitive organisms. These chemicals are sometimes called environmental estrogens or androgens because they often cause sexual dysfunction, reproductive health problems in females, or feminization in males, for example. They are just as likely, however, to disrupt thyroxine functions or those of other important regulatory molecules as they are to obstruct sex hormones. This figure shows the effect of steroid hormones. Plasma hormone carriers deliver regulatory molecules to the cell surface where they cross the cell membrane. Intracellular receptors deliver hormones to the nucleus where they bind to and regulate expression of DNA. Estrogen-like compounds bind to receptors and either block uptake of the endogenous hormones or act as a substitute hormone to disrupt gene expression. Now let's move to a discussion of how toxic chemicals move in the environment and what happens to them. We call this the fate and transport of toxic chemicals. We can think of both individuals and an ecosystem as sets of interacting compartments between which chemicals move based on molecular size, solubility, stability, and reactivity. The dose or amount, the route of entry, the timing of the exposure, and sensitivity of the organism all play important roles in determining its toxicity. In this section, we will consider some of these characteristics and how they affect environmental health. In this slide, we see that there are several factors that determine whether a chemical will be toxic to a particular organism. One of the major factors is the chemical's composition. These factors include the physical and chemical composition, if there are any impurities that are present as a result of the manufacturing process, the stability of that compound in the environment, and how it moves through the environment to reach a target organism. Some factors are related to how the target organism is exposed to the chemical. For instance, what kind of dose and volume was involved in the exposure? How long was the target organism exposed to the chemical? And how frequently? Another important aspect is the route of exposure. Was the chemical inhaled or absorbed through the skin or consumed in food or water? These factors will help determine the extent of the toxic effect. Finally, some factors are related to the organism itself. This could be the ability of the organism to metabolize the toxic substance, how easily the toxic substance can enter the organism, the genetic characteristics of the organism, its nutritional status or age, sex, and body weight, even its immunological status. Solubility is one of the most important characteristics in determining how, where, and when a toxic chemical will move through the environment or through the body to its site of action. Chemicals can be divided into two major groups: those that dissolve more readily in water, hydrophilic compounds, and those that dissolve more readily in oil, hydrophobic compounds. Water-soluble compounds move rapidly and widely through the environment because water is ubiquitous. They also tend to have ready access to most cells in the body because aqueous solutions bathe all our cells. Molecules that are oil or fat soluble, usually organic molecules, generally need a carrier to move through the environment and into or within our body. Once inside the body, however, oil-soluble toxics penetrate readily into tissues and cells because the membranes that enclose cells are themselves made of similar oil-soluble chemicals. Once inside cells, oil-soluble materials are likely to accumulate and to be stored in lipid deposits where they may be protected from metabolic breakdown and persist for many years. The condition of the organism and timing of exposure also have strong influences on toxicity. Healthy adults, for instance, may be relatively insensitive to doses that are very dangerous to young children or to someone already weakened by other diseases. Pound for pound, children drink more water, eat more food, and breathe more air than do adults. Putting fingers, toys, and other objects into their mouths increases children's exposure to toxics in dust or soils. Furthermore, children generally have less developed immune systems or processes to degrade or excrete toxics. The developing brain is especially sensitive to damage. Obviously, disrupting the complex and sensitive processes of brain growth and development can have tragic long-term consequences. Researchers estimate that 1 in 6 children in America has a developmental disability, usually involving the nervous system. The best known example of an environmental risk for children is lead poisoning. Before lead paint and leaded gasoline were banned in the 1970s, at least 4 million American children had dangerous levels of lead in their blood. Banning these products has been one of the greatest successes in environmental health. Blood lead levels in children have fallen more than 90% in the past 3 decades. Unfortunately, this tremendous success hasn't yet extended to developing countries. In 2009, the China Daily reported that 1.1 million children are born in China every year with birth defects attributed to environmental factors. Earlier, we discussed the various routes of exposure to toxic and hazardous environmental factors. How we respond to exposure to a toxic substance depends in part on how it enters our bodies. This figure shows all the different ways that chemical compounds can breach our defenses and enter into us. For example, lead can enter our bodies through application of cosmetics. Hazardous substances dissolved in water can enter through our drinking water. And hazardous substances or infectious agents can enter our lungs as we breathe contaminated air. In this slide, we see that lead, which is the most common toxin in children, can enter the body through a variety of means. For instance, leaded gasoline, which deposits lead in the soil, through paint chips that children can ingest, through imported cosmetics, also in painted toys, pottery and ceramics, and also in drinking water. Lead continues to be a recurring problem in our water supply. The recent problems in Flint, Michigan, caused by improper treatment of the water supply to the city, caused lead to leach from the water pipes, poisoning thousands of children and causing irreversible brain damage. Once a chemical enters the body, it can accumulate. Cells have mechanisms for bioaccumulation, the selective absorption and storage of a great variety of molecules. This allows them to accumulate nutrients and essential minerals, but at the same time, they may also absorb and store harmful substances through the same mechanisms. Materials that are rather dilute in the environment can reach dangerous levels inside cells and tissues through this process of bioaccumulation. Toxic substances can also be magnified through food webs. Biomagnification occurs when the toxic burden of a large number of organisms at a lower trophic level is accumulated and concentrated by a predator at a higher trophic level. Phytoplankton and bacteria in aquatic ecosystems, for instance, take up heavy metals or toxic organic molecules from water or sediments. Their predators, zooplankton and small fish, collect and retain the toxics from many prey organisms, building up higher concentrations of the toxics. The top carnivores in the food chain, game fish, fish-eating birds, and humans, can accumulate such high toxic levels that they suffer adverse health effects. Bioaccumulation is typically associated with the compounds with high lipid solubility and the ability to accumulate in fatty tissues of living organisms. Persistent chemicals tend to have higher concentrations and are eliminated more slowly. Dietary accumulation or bioaccumulation is another hallmark characteristic of persistent pollutants, which move up the food chain and increase in concentration as they're processed and metabolized in certain tissues of organisms. The natural capacity for animals' gastrointestinal tracts to concentrate and ingest chemicals, along with poorly metabolized and hydrophobic nature of these persistent pollutants, makes such compounds highly susceptible to bioaccumulation. Heavy metals, such as lead and mercury, are classic examples of persistent pollutants. Persistent pollutants are dangerous because they persist so very long in the environment and are not susceptible to many of nature's detoxification mechanisms. Two of the most common chemicals are mercury and lead. Mercury, like lead, can destroy nerve cells and is particularly dangerous to children. The largest source of mercury in the United States is from burning coal. Every year, power plants in the United States release 48 tons of mercury into the air. It works its way through food chains and is concentrated to dangerous levels in fish. Mercury contamination is the most common cause of lakes and rivers failing to meet pollution regulation standards. Many organic compounds, such as PVC plastics, fire retardants, and chlorinated hydrocarbon pesticides, also are highly resistant to degradation. Persistent organic pollutants are organic chemical substances, that is, they are carbon-based. They possess a particular combination of physical and chemical properties such that once released into the environment, they remain intact for exceptionally long periods of time, become widely distributed through the environment as a result of natural processes involving soil, water, and most notably air. They may turn into vapor at high temperatures, be transported long distances through air currents, and then condense out in colder, typically Arctic regions. They accumulate in fatty tissues of living organisms, including humans, and are found at higher concentrations at higher levels in the food chain, and they're toxic to both humans and wildlife. As a result of releases to the environment over the past several decades, due especially to human activities, persistent organic pollutants are now widely distributed over large regions, in particularly places where they've never been used. They can be found throughout the globe. This extensive contamination of environmental media and living organisms, including many foodstuffs, and has resulted in the sustained exposure of many species, including humans, for periods of time that span generations, resulting in both acute and chronic toxic effects. The Stockholm Convention regulates these chemicals, but the United States is not a signatory to the convention. Some materials produce antagonistic reactions. That is, they interfere with the effects or stimulate the breakdown of other chemicals. For instance, vitamins E and A can reduce the response to some carcinogens. Other materials are additive when they occur together in exposures. Rats exposed to both lead and arsenic show twice the toxicity of only one of these elements. Perhaps the greatest concern is synergistic effects. Synergism is an interaction in which one substance exacerbates the effects of another. For example, occupational asbestos exposure increases lung cancer rates 20-fold. Smoking increases lung cancer rates by the same amount. But asbestos workers who also smoke have a 400-fold increase in cancer rates. How many other toxic chemicals are we exposed to that are below threshold limits individually, but combine to give toxic results? In this lecture, we have learned that toxicology is the study of how external factors affect living organisms. We learned that environmental toxicology studies how these chemicals move and interact in the environment. For examples, how chemicals can migrate from water to sediment into living organisms and then concentrate as you proceed up the trophic levels. We learned that there are 5 classes of harmful chemical agents, including neurotoxins like lead or mercury, mutagens like chemicals or radiation that cause genetic damage, teratogens that cause fetal abnormalities, carcinogens, and hormone disruptors. We learned that there are many factors that influence how a chemical will move and be transformed in the environment, and one of the main characteristics of a chemical is its water solubility. Some chemicals, particularly ones with low water solubility, often bioaccumulate, and persistent pollutants such as chlorinated hydrocarbons, polychlorinated biphenyls, lead, and mercury can persist in the environment for a very long time. Persistent organic pollutants can be found in polar regions, far away from their original sources because of the long-range transport of vapor. These chemicals may vaporize at high temperatures, be transported long distances via air currents, and then condense out in colder Arctic regions.